Did you know that you can use baking soda as a natural deodorant? Also known as sodium bicarbonate, baking soda seems to have 1,000,001 uses. In addition to being used as a leavening agent when baking, it can also be used to clean and deodorize surfaces and even safe for treating conditions such as heartburn. Don't just take this video's word for it. To find out more, check out our video titled 7 Unexpected Health Benefits of Baking Soda. But then what do you do if a recipe calls for baking soda and you don't have any in the house? Well, you could rush to the store and buy some, or you could check and see if there's anything already in your pantry that you can use as a substitution. Here are just a few alternatives you can use when baking without baking soda. Before we start though, be sure to click on the subscribe and notification button. Also, support our channel by watching until the end. Number 1. Baking powder. People often get baking soda and baking powder confused with each other, which is probably due in part to their similar sounding names. Fortunately, even if you do get the two confused, it doesn't matter because they're essentially interchangeable, at least as far as actual baking is concerned. This is because baking powder, at least in part, is made with baking soda as a key ingredient. The other main ingredient that is used for baking powder is potassium bitartrate, otherwise known as cream of tartar. Cream of tartar is the powdered form of tartaric acid, a natural substance found in a certain variety of plants. And just like baking soda, cream of tartar also is a leavening agent, making it a useful addition when baking. With this in mind, baking soda is a more than adequate substitution for baking powder in the event that you don't have the latter on hand. There is a trade-off, however. Baking powder isn't quite as effective compared to regular old baking soda. So if you want to have the same potency as baking soda, you'll need to use about 3 times as much powder as you normally would. That means, for example, using 3 teaspoons of baking powder when the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of baking soda. Also worth mentioning, but using baking powder as an alternative to baking soda may also slightly alter the taste of whatever it is you're baking. So your mileage may vary on how useful baking powder is as an alternative. To compensate for the added saltiness and acidity of baking powder, you may want to reduce the amount of salt the recipe calls for, as well as any other ingredients with a high acidity content. Nevertheless, if the stores are closed and you're out of baking soda, beggars can't be choosers, am I right? Number 2. Baker's ammonia. Feel free to try baking using baker's ammonia instead of baking soda. Also known by the more scientific name of ammonium carbonate, baker's ammonia was the leavening agent of choice for bakers everywhere dating back to the 13th century. While it was eventually phased out in favor of baking soda and baking powder in most modern practices, baker's ammonia still plays a niche role in baking that still gives us plenty of usefulness in the modern kitchen. What makes baker's ammonia distinct among other leavening ingredients is the uniquely crisp taste and texture it imparts on baked goods, leading to a distinct and delicious creation such as thin, crispy cookies and crackers. This can potentially prove to be both a blessing as well as a curse. While this makes baker's ammonia a great addition to a variety of specialty recipes, this also means that baker's ammonia might not be a suitable alternative to baking soda for all recipes. Another thing to be mindful of is the smell. Ammonia is famously known for its pungent aromas, and baker's ammonia is no exception. In particular, baker's ammonia produces a combination of ammonia as well as carbon dioxide when exposed to heat and acid, which can lead to a particularly unpleasant smell that you can potentially stink up your kitchen with. While thin baked goods will dissipate this smell, thicker baked goods such as a muffin or cake might retain the ammonia smell even after baking, which is another reason why baker's ammonia might not be ideal as a substitute in all situations. Needless to say, be sure to crack a window open before you start experimenting with this one. Number 3. Self-rising flour. Tired of having to buy all your baking ingredients separately? Always forgetting to add at least one key ingredient to your shopping list? Luckily, you can always turn your trip for baking supplies into a one-stop shop by picking up some self-rising flour instead. Self-rising flour is a combination of different baking ingredients that have already been handily mixed together, namely all-purpose flour, combined with around 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. However, before you try to jump right into using self-rising flour for all your baking needs, there are a few things you have to take into consideration. First of all, the fact that self-rising flour comes pre-portioned with baking powder and salt already thrown into the mix means that you may need to make some adjustments to your recipe as compensation. Otherwise, it could potentially interfere with the taste and quality of the final product. Because baking powder already contains an acidic component as well, you'll also want to replace the acid in your recipe with something a little more neutral in order to get the desired leavening reaction as well. For one example of how this would play out, if using self-rising flour, you'll probably want to switch out the buttermilk with regular milk instead to avoid going overboard on the recipe's acid content. Overall, self-rising flour is not what you'd call an ideal ingredient for amateur bakers to play around with, and it may require a little bit of trial and error before you get the hang of using it in all your baking recipes. Still, don't think of this as a reason to get discouraged if you're new to using this particular ingredient. After all, practice does make perfect. Number 4. Potassium bicarbonate. Potassium bicarbonate is commonly used as a dietary supplement, but in a pinch, it can also be used as a leavening agent for baked goods. Because it doesn't contain any sodium, potassium bicarbonate might be an ideal substitution for people who are trying to reduce their sodium intake. The trade-off for using potassium bicarbonate, of course, is that the reduced salt content will also have a noticeable effect on the taste of whatever you're baking. So be prepared to have some slight variation. Then again, if sodium intake is not one of your concerns, you can always add a little extra salt to the recipe as a way to compensate. Baking is an art, not a science, or at least that's what some of us like to tell ourselves. If you're halfway through baking a cake only to realize that you're out of baking soda, hopefully, you have some of these other ingredients lying around your pantry instead. We're interested in hearing about your kitchen experiences, so be sure to leave a contribution in the comment section below and help us keep that conversation going. Enjoyed this video? Hit like, share, and subscribe to Bestie. Wait! What kind of bestie are we if we don't tell you about our other awesome videos? Go ahead, choose the left or right video and enjoy.